today's World Insight. The third China International Import Expo about to take off.
这次疫情告诫我。
The pandemic reminds us that all countries are a community with a shared future, and no one can stand alone in the face of major crises.
How crucial is this year's expo to global recovery amid the COVID-19 surge? And growing opportunities for music and piano sales in the Chinese market? Could piano pieces strike a chord with CIIE visitors? The lowdown from Ron Losty, the CEO of the famous American piano maker Steinway & Son.
Growth is so pronounced in China.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Let's begin with the upcoming third China International Import Expo, or known as CIIE. The six-day expo will start on Thursday in Shanghai despite surging COVID-19 cases outside China. Thanks to tight pandemic control measures, China has made the swiftest recovery from the pandemic among major economies so far. In the first three quarters, China's economy grew by 0.7% from a year earlier, while the rest of the world is still largely mired in recession. The country's total imports and exports also posted positive year-on-year growth in the same period. It's expected the third CIIE, by far the world's first import-themed national exhibition, will show China's renewed commitment to rule-based global trade and providing greater market access to foreign firms despite of rising protectionism elsewhere in the world. For more on the latest development on CIIE, I'm joined here in the studio, Greg Gilligan, Chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce, AmCham in China. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you. Likewise.
It's been a while. And also, Mel Weiwen, Senior Fellow from the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies with Renmin University. Mr. He, good to see you as well.
Good to see you. It's great.
The ongoing CIIE, the Import Expo. This is the third time, as you may know, Mr. Gilligan. And this time, despite of the pandemic, it is going to be in-person exhibition. And even the exhibition area has been expanded even than last year. So how much do you see this enthusiasm in the air still about the Chinese market, particularly from the American business perspective, of course?
It's been very direct in that the economy has stood back up quite quickly, and we do still have issues where many of our executives are offshore and having trouble getting back. So we need to solve that, because for foreign multinationals to be able to continue to invest and drive business decisions, they need their executives on the ground, along with their families and support workers like educators and healthcare workers, etc. However, everybody is encouraged by how quickly the economy's got back on its feet, and recent numbers, whether it's manufacturing or consumer activity, etc. Those are all things that we see. We also hear from our members that they are being tasked by their global entities to have the China market help carry some of the gap that they're facing in other parts of the world.
Just to follow up about what you said about the executives and their families, the pandemic situation in the U.S. unfortunately is getting ever more worrisome.
Yes.
So that also puts some hindrance about what we can do together, isn't it?
That's a very fair statement. It's just the reality that the global pandemic in other parts of the world is not going in the right direction. And so naturally, governments will be conservative about how they open or do not open their borders. But everything's a balance, because people need health and safety, and society needs an economy to support it. So it's a balancing act.
It is a balancing act, and the balancing act has very much been the focal point for China's 14th five-year plan. There's a lot to balance about, and higher quality of opening up, but at the same time speed up the reform. Mr. He, how is the CIIE, in your view, can reflect kind of ambition and aspiration?
I think CIIE by name means import, exposition. That's trade. But actually, CIIE has more meaning than that. That means it shows that China is ready and it has been and it will continue to open up to the whole world. And not only open up for imports, some say apples, foods, and that's beyond that. The best technologies, resources, and technology from the world to support China's high-grade development. Without a high standard opening up, it would not have been possible to attain the medium-high quality development.
Well, therefore, it comes to the tricky part, isn't it? Technology. It is no secret that between China and the United States, there is a somewhat technological competition. So, Mr. Gilligan, many of your members actually are in the field or related to the field on the supply chain. So, what do you make about that kind of aspiration coming from China? Realities inside the United States, especially when we observe the latest development of the election result. To match the two, can there still be match anymore?
As business people, we also track geopolitics, mostly so that we can stay out of them. But
good point.
In that context, in order for us to drive commerce in the way that we hope to, we observe what's going on, and it's quite simple that much of that is outside of our lane. So we stay in our commercial lane, and then we try to ask the respective governments to keep the concerns of national security and law enforcement as narrow as is appropriate and broaden the commercial lane as much as possible. So we don't want each to use excuses to limit the commercial opportunity of the other. We all know that this is a difficult time in the U.S.-China relationship, and we advocate against decoupling, as do our members, because what we do is good for the American people and the Chinese people. So American business being in China is a good thing, and we work very hard to try to demonstrate that. There's ways that we can focus on areas where we may be able to cooperate as opposed to trying to break down the barriers of those more contentious areas. You know, in the famous words of Zhou Enlai, it was to seek commonalities and put aside differences.
Set aside the differences and seek common ground, as Mr. Zhou said. Mr. He, is there much common ground, and can differences be put aside, especially when you look at the election and the likely up of 4 years?
We don't know the result of the election. However, if we look forward to the next 4 years, I'm confident that the bilateral trade relations will improve from the worst state situation.
You think we already reached the bottom line there, even though some analysts believe the other way around?
It's different. I just said regarding the bilateral trade, we have already seen a pickup in the bilateral trade for the first 9 months of this year. China's exports already was picking up fast. In the single months, July, August, September, the monthly Chinese export in dollar terms exceeded monthly average of 2018, the highest in history. While imports from the United States has also been increasing. For the first 9 months, the imports from the United States increased by 2.8% year on year, while China's imports from the worldwide is still in negative ground. So that means both countries are working towards the bilateral trade.
Having said that, though, we did notice, for example, in the high-tech area, the bans on Chinese on exporting to China and providing certain important components through the supply chain by the U.S. side has been, in fact, exercised through executive order. Now, we do not know the result of this election, and we do not know, even for the same person, the policies of the first 4 years, will they likely continue for the second term? Now, we don't know about that. And of course, if it's a different president, whether the policy will be similar in logic or very different in logic, we don't know either. But it does leave the executive order, only the use of it, some rooms for maneuvering, some suggest. Now, Mr. Gilligan, do you see that is a possibility? How big a possibility is that? Do you see much room for maneuvering from the U.S. policymakers' perspective regarding their approach to China?
It's clearly been the case because we've seen the use of executive orders fairly frequently in this recent period of time. The nature of the American system, however, is one of a separation of powers from the executive branch, the judiciary, and the legislature. And so when you see the executive branch using these executive orders in this way, there is still always the possibility of review by the judicial branch and or newly legislated boundaries by the legislature.
We see some ups and downs over the past few years, haven't we? That we have been suggesting China-U.S. trade relations has been the pillar of the relations and stabilizing factor. And then we see some turbulence, particularly complaints from the American business community, some of your members as well, about China's opening up policy, about this and that. And that also have an impact on the lobbying in Washington toward the current White House, one could argue. Mm-hmm. And now we also see, once again, another term, that the American business community here in China, at least, that I've been talking to, are seeing, you know, the current stage is certainly not the way to go. They want to come back to negotiation and discussion, and not necessarily cutting off and decoupling. So, Mr. He, what does that mean for China to adjust and to bring the best possibility when it comes to partnership and work on policies if possible?
I think the best way, or one of the best, the good ways for the Chinese government is to approach the American business community, to listen attentively their complaints, their needs, their requirements, and to judge. And also we hope that the American business provides more fact-based complaints and requirements so we can work together to find out what really we should improve. So many of the complaints are reasonable. We should do something towards that direction. If we say we have been doing pretty well, what is the point of further opening up to further reform? That means we have problems. In this regard, we should work closely with the American business community. Of course, they also complain with the American government, with the U.S. government. For instance, U.S. CBC, the Senate report, the USTR, complained about the compulsory transfer of technology, and that was used in the 301 investigation report. However, they were firmly against the tariffs. So it's complicated. We should work carefully with the business community.
Interesting. Mr. Gilligan, I'm sure you know much better about this zigzagging trend than what I just illustrated.
I think there's an interesting way to think about this problem. I describe it as a bit of a time warp.
Explain, please.
Sure. It's, you know, we all know about jet lag, where if you fly for 14 hours to go from China to the U.S., you experience some jet lag. I'm not talking about a gap of hours. I'm referring to a gap of years. And so for those of us who live in China, work here, have so many relationships with Chinese friends and family, we have maybe a different boots on the ground perspective about what is happening and what is likely to happen going forward. Whereas in the Beltway in D.C., Washington, D.C., their understanding of China maybe is rooted in 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. And it takes a while for them to catch up. So 6, 7 years ago, and I was chair at a different point in time for AmCham China, I was in Washington saying, you need to get tougher on China because they'll respect that. We'll come together in a way where more parity of opportunity. And people said, oh, that's, you know, we don't believe in that, and reciprocity is not in our vocabulary, and so forth. And now that's all they talk about. We advocated for it, got criticized for it, and now we're advocating, saying, look, we need to take a step back. We need to find these common areas. We need to think about how we can work together. And then what we do is we provide some ideas on how to do that.
Will there be decoupling, though? Even though we talk about the confidence in the China market, will American businesses have to think about 2 ways of doing things? One is in China, the other is in the rest of the world. And so do the Chinese businesses have to worry about doing what they're doing in China and going to the United States totally different from the rest of the world? Mr. He, maybe I go to you first, and then Mr. Gilligan.
As far as decoupling is concerned, I think individual shift of the investment of facilities or technology restrictions are always there. We don't worry too much about that. What we should pay attention is the general trend. In general trend, the decoupling between China and U.S. business is impossible, because we can classify generally into 3 different categories. First, the military use, they're always decoupled. We've had CARCOM Paris first, then Wasena arrangement later. It's decoupled. However, China's technology in this area is still growing. And the second area, ordinary products. So the 2-way trade is still growing. As I mentioned earlier, that I believe that bilateral U.S.-China trade, according to China's statistics, will top historical high by 2021. And also, then the third category, the high-tech, especially semiconductor chips or the 5Gs, they will be very difficult. They will harm both China and the U.S. But in the end, they will not be successful. For instance, we say that China accounts for 18% of world market for semiconductors offered by the United States. If the total ban on China, exporting to China, the United States will lose the 18% share. Then the world market share will fall from current 48% to 30%. Then the United States will be no longer the world's largest supplier, maybe Korea or China.
So, Mr. Gilligan, what's your response to what Mr. He just said?
Well, I'll address that, but I want to answer your question first. And so, could there be decoupling? Of course there could. Should there be? In our view, no. And all we need to do as business people, it's pretty simple for us, we just need to meet the compliance requirements of the countries where we operate. So in this case, the U.S. and China. And then we don't need to worry about the governance aspect of it, because we've met the letter of the law, therefore we can go forward. Now, recognizing the relationship's in a bad place right now, and there's a lot of sensitive areas, including tech and other places, where it'd be harder for us to get support from either side to say, hey, we want to do something in, well, I won't name the sectors, but there are several. Whereas, if we focus on areas that are less contentious, and I'll say areas like public health, global wellness, environmental protection, these are areas where there should be broader agreement that what we do together is good for the whole world. So what we're trying to do, and I've been working with some of Chinese specialists on this side, and particularly in public health, we're trying to do is to create a platform that would allow Chinese enterprise and U.S. enterprise to come together, do research and development, product development, and then also some social impact initiatives, which is sort of another word for corporate social responsibility. And maybe along the way we can bring small and medium-sized enterprises onto that platform as well to help drive the economy. So we're looking to focus on areas where we can agree, not the ones we can't.
Now, from now until January the 20th, there will be a lot of uncertainties. I'm not saying after that there would not be, or less, but that's at least in the foreseeable future. So how do you think that both sides should interact with one another for the remaining of the year until the President of the United States, another term or a new one, comes into the office? Mr. Gilligan.
Well, I certainly hope that we build on the strength of the relationship that Vice Premier Liu He has with Ambassador Lighthizer and Secretary Mnuchin. So one of the best things that we can do would be to make sure that the Phase 1 trade deal is a success. That way both sides can credibly represent to their own interests that things are happening in the best possible way. That then sets up the conversation for necessary structural reform that would fall into more of a Phase 2 category of a trade deal. So whether it's market access, intellectual property protection, technology transfer, et cetera. So continue down that path, set up a foundation so that the second version of the administration or a new administration can then build from there.
Mr. He, for China, it's a different story.
We do always say the geopolitics. Now we say geotrade. Geotrade, the largest partner for China in global trade is Asia. Asia accounts for 51% of China's total trade. Of course, ASEAN is the largest group, and also we have Japan, South Korea, and many other Asian countries. And then Europe accounts for 19%. And North America accounts now for only 14 to 15%. So global-wise, the largest focus of China's trade is Asia. Because Asia and Europe is linked in the continent, so Asia and Euro-Asia accounts for 70% of China's trade. That's formidable. And of course, this does not mean that the United States is not important. But country-wise, the United States is still the largest trade partner of China. And because of the weight of the U.S. in the world economy and in the world order, we should lose no efforts to try to solidify, maintain relations, sound relations, or try as sound as possible with the U.S.
You know, we used to talk about the world order. We talk about geopolitics, nation-to-nation relations. But now it's much more complex than just the relation between the countries. How should we jump out of this earlier old frame that has made the Cold War the case and be able to focus on the real possibilities? Not to mention the fourth industrial revolution is already with us. So I'm sure you have your thoughts from different perspectives. Help us to entice it, please.
I'll come back to what we do, which is, we think, the foundation of U.S.-China relations. And when we do things together that demonstrate to both sides the benefits to each society of our business activity, we'll get support. Now, the frameworks that go around that in order to allow or regulate activity are going to evolve, and we just need to evolve with them. So I'll just say, whether it's the global wellness, environmental protection, those kinds of things, that we need to continue to go forward, demonstrate success, and then of course, multilateralism is great. We should all have a voice. We should all be able to talk about what's necessary for global benefit. But there's no getting around the fact that global benefit is largely hinged on the success of the U.S.-China relationship.
Mr. He?
Yes, and there has been sayings about the possible Cold War between China and the United States, and some compared it to the previous Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. But the two things are totally uncomparable, because we just mentioned the economic base. At that time, there was minimal trade between U.S. and the Soviet Union, because Soviet Union has a separate market structure within its neighboring countries, and very little in the free trade, in convertible currency trade with the West, including the United States. But today, China and the United States are in total different situation, because of sound and extensive economic relations, and also strong links in the global supply chain, make it very difficult to couple, to have the curtain drawing down between the two countries. Unimaginable. We can, a very simple example, Germany and France fighting each other for centuries, but after World War, the Robert Schuman, the French foreign minister, proposed the plan, Schuman plan, to build up the community for the Europe. So they connect each other, invested in each other, and they formed a common market, making it impossible to fight each other.
And you're watching World Insights, still to come on our program today.